Test, test. We good? Okay. All right, well, we'll get started. It's good to see everybody. So we're in Nahum chapter 2. So just a brief recap on Nahum. Nahum's a little bit different than the other prophets in the sense that he doesn't really give a message against God's people. It's really a message for God's people, a message of hope. And what it is, it's a message against Assyria. So Assyria has been the world power on the scene for several hundred years at this point, and they are known for being very brutal and causing a lot of terror for the surrounding countries. And so the people of God, the country of Judah, is currently a vassal state of Assyria at this point. And so the message is one of hope for God's people that God is going to punish Assyria for all their wicked deeds. And that's really what the book is about. So as we move into chapter 2 and 3, it becomes more of a direct talking to Assyria, although Assyria would not have heard the message. This would be Nahum speaking to the people of Judah about Assyria. But the threats become directed against Assyria, and so it becomes a little bit more detailed. As we go tonight, we may go a little quicker than we normally do because some of this is fairly self-explanatory. There's not a whole lot to say about some of it. All right, so if you start in verse 1 of chapter 2, just to kind of reiterate the time frame. So Assyria captured Israel, the northern kingdom, in 722, 721. And then somebody asked a while back, when was Jonah? Because remember, Jonah went to Nineveh. That would have been about, we don't know for sure, but somewhere around 760. So then about 40 years after Jonah goes to Nineveh, they take the northern kingdom, which is Israel. And so then when is this that Nahum is talking? This is, you can't really pin it down because he doesn't say who is the king, but most scholars think it's probably somewhere between 650 and when Nineveh actually falls, which is in 612 BC. So somewhere in the latter half of the 600s is probably when this is. So the things that are being prophesied here will occur in 612 BC. That's when this ends up happening, okay? And so what will end up happening is Babylon, which is a separate country from Assyria, they will end up attacking Nineveh and capturing the city and defeating the Assyrians, along with the Medes and the Scythians, but generally speaking, the Babylonians are the ones giving credit for it. Okay, so if you look at verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, "He who scatters has come up before your face." The person scattering here, it could either be talking about God himself, or he could be referring to the Babylonians. Either one, it's whoever is going to be attacking them is who he's talking about. And then the rest of the verse is God basically taunting Assyria, okay? So he's saying, he's telling them to get ready to fight, but it's in more of a mocking style because God knows they're going to lose, okay? So it would be like you trying to pump me up to fight the heavyweight champion of the world. Like, we all know I'm not going to win. But it's sort of a mocking type thing where God is making fun of them. And so he says, "Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily." So all that is a mock because they have no chance of winning, and God knows that. Okay, so verse 2, now God speaks directly to his people about what the outcome of this will be for them. And he says, "For the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel." So he's basically saying, I'm going to restore you, after Assyria is taken care of. And then he says, "For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches." And what he's talking about is at this time, Judah, now remember, Israel has already gone into captivity and they're not a country anymore. But Judah still is a country, but they're a vassal state of Assyria at this point. And so Assyria has already come in to Judah once and got all the way up to Jerusalem before God stopped their advance. But in the process, they took a lot of prisoners, they took a lot of wealth and loot out of the country at that time. And so Judah has become weakened, Judah's a vassal state. And that's what he's talking about when he says the emptiers have emptied them out, meaning Assyria has already looted a lot of both people and resources out of Judah. And in the process, they ruined the vine branches, which is just another way of saying that they have weakened Judah in the process. Now he's going to go back to the battle scene, and the next several verses are just describing the battle and what it's going to look like when it comes about. It says, "The shields of his mighty men are made of red." This could be the red could be a couple different things. That could mean the shields are copper, or it could mean that their insignia or just their shields in general were painted red. I think Babylon often used red as their color in fighting, so that may be what he's referring to. He says, the valiant men are in scarlet. The chariots come with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the spears are brandished. So he starts off talking about the cavalry, and then he kind of moves into talking about the infantry as they advance on the city. Verse 4, the chariots rage in the streets. They jostle one another in the broad roads. They seem like torches. They run like lightning. In other words, the chariots are very fast as they're attacking, and so forth. The next verse, he remembers his nobles. I think the ESV says captains there, maybe. They stumble in their walk, they make haste to their walls, and the defense is prepared. And this verse, it's hard to really know, is he talking about the attackers and how they are attacking, or is he talking about the ones defending and how they're trying to defend? It doesn't really make a big difference either way, but the word defense there in the last line, a lot of other translations say something to the effect of like the siege tower. It's a Hebrew word that's really hard to know exactly what it's referring to, but it's probably some kind of siege tower or ramp or something that you would push up against the wall of the city to try to either knock the wall down or get your troops over the wall and into the city. So that's probably what it's referring to. Sorry. Verse 6, the gates of the river are opened and the palace is dissolved. Dissolved there, it means the palace has become weakened or damaged in some way. And what it's talking about here, so Nineveh as a city had 15 gates around it. So it's a completely walled city, but the wall has 15 gates in the wall. And 5 of the gates are on the Tigris River. So if you remember from the introduction, the city sat on the Tigris River, but then there's a separate river that runs through the city as well. I forget the exact name of it. Kir or something, can't remember. Anyway, so there's a smaller river that runs through the city, and that river dumps into the Tigris River. So you have 2 rivers here that the city is on. In addition to that, they had built an aqueduct to the city as well. So there's a lot of different water supplies coming into the city. So some people think that this is referring to how the city was destroyed, that it was flooded in some way. And it may have been flooded in some way, but there's 2 issues with saying that it was flooded as the main way it was destroyed. One, all the archaeological evidence points to the city burning, and that's really how it was destroyed. So that speaks against it. The other issue is that we know from historical records that the city was destroyed in August, and that is not the rainy season. So what is it talking about here? It could be one of 2 things. It could be that there are some historical records that state that part of the wall was damaged, and it may have been damaged in the preceding rainy season and had not yet been fixed, and then that would allow some additional damage to take place from some flooding or something like that. The other thing could be that some of the gates for the aqueduct or the rivers could have been opened to intentionally flood parts of the city as a way of destroying it. And that may be true too. So the city may have been destroyed partially by water, but also by fire, and that may be what Nahum's getting at here. Anyway, not entirely sure. So verse 7, it says, it is decreed, and he shall lead away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maidservants shall lead her as with the voice of doves beating their breasts. This verse, sorry, I kind of stumbled over this because it's fairly different than the ESV in the New King James. So what this is talking about, when it says she shall be led away captive, who is the she? It's one of two she's, I guess I will say. It's either the queen of Nineveh or it's Ishtar. So Ishtar is the goddess of the city. So there's a lot of Assyrian god and goddesses that they worship, but particularly in Nineveh there were two. There is Ishtar, who is the female goddess, and there is, I think the male goddess they had there was Nabu, which is a different male god. Anyway, Nabu's not really relevant here. So Ishtar, you see Ishtar throughout the ancient Near East. She has different names depending on where you go in the ancient Near East. So she'll show up in the Bible with different names at different places. So she's sometimes called Astarte. Ishtar is a fairly common one. I think I've mentioned this before. It's not the same goddess, but it's a very similar type goddess in the New Testament when you get to Diana or Artemis, whichever name you want to call her. But a lot of the ancient Near Eastern countries worshiped a goddess of this name with this sort of ideology or mythology behind that particular goddess. And there's one famous Old Testament woman who is actually named after this goddess. Does anybody know who that would be? There's actually a book of the Bible with this woman's name. That should narrow it down quite a bit for you. Esther, good. Okay, so Esther actually is the name Astarte, okay, which is another name for Ishtar. So why is she called Astarte or Esther? Well, that is not her Hebrew name. That is her Persian name, okay? Her Hebrew name, I don't remember the Hebrew of it, but it means myrtle. Not a super popular name anymore, but anyway, that was her Hebrew name. But her Persian name was what we call Esther, which is Astarte, essentially, or a derivation of that. So anyway, so this is either the queen, or this is the actual goddess, the actual statue of the goddess being led away. So why is this relevant in either case? Well, a lot of what we start seeing in chapter 2 and chapter 3 is all of the evil that Assyria had done to other countries, it's coming back on them. So, we have the expression, what goes around comes around, and that's sort of what's starting to be proclaimed here by Nahum. So what are some of the things that Assyria did to other countries? Well, this is common in the ancient Near East in general, but when you defeat a country, you take their god or goddess out of their temple and you bring it back to your country, okay? And typically you would parade it through the streets and then you would put it in one of your temples, and that was a way to show that you had defeated the other country and that your God is stronger than their God, okay? So if you think back to Judges, for instance, they took the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple in the Philistines, and that caused Dagon to fall over and all that stuff. But anyway, it's the same principle being applied in that story as well. And so what it's saying, if it's talking about Ishtar, then what it's saying is when the Babylonians come in, they are going to take your goddess statue out and take it back to Babylon, okay? There are lots of cases of Assyria doing this, and in the archaeological remains in Nineveh, they did find statues from Egypt in Nineveh. So this is something that they had done previously themselves. If it's talking about the queen, then it's just saying that the Babylonians will strip her and parade her around as a way of mocking her, okay? Which is also something that the Assyrians would do as well, okay? As you move on, it says, her maidservants shall lead her as with the voice of doves beating their breasts. If it's the queen, then this would be her attendants. If it's the goddess Ishtar, it would just be the female slaves that worked at the temple. So it could be either one. And then the part about their voice as doves and beating their breasts, that just means they're sort of mourning what is going on, basically. Okay. Verse 8, it says, though Nineveh of old was like a pool of water, now they flee away. So in other words, in a pool, they were all collectively in the city, but now the people are fleeing the city. And then it says, halt, halt, they cry, but no one turns back. And what that's referencing is people are running out of the city as they see the Babylonians coming to try to get away or flee because they know they're not going to win. And so the halt, halt would be like military commanders saying, halt, the soldiers, you need to stand, you need to fight, you need to protect. And they're just ignoring them and running for the hills, basically, is what the idea is. Okay, so verse 9, now God is talking to the invaders, so Babylon in particular, and it says, take spoil of silver, take spoil of gold. There is no end of treasure or wealth of every desirable prize. And so what he's referring to here, so Nineveh had been the capital of Assyria at the time you get to 612 when this is happening. Nineveh had been the capital for about 90 years, okay? And so what they had done is all these places they had conquered, they would bring all the wealth of those countries back to Nineveh and store it in Nineveh. So Nineveh became super wealthy with all this ill-gotten gain that they had. So they had all this silver and gold, they had all these statues, gods and goddesses and so forth that they had accumulated and brought back to Nineveh. And so he's saying to the Babylonians, as you go in, take it all, loot the whole city. And when you look at the Babylonian Chronicles, which is Babylon's historical records, they do say that they looted the city. And then there's a different historical document that says that actually the wealth of the city went back to the capital city of the Medes. So the Babylonians may not have taken it for themselves. They may have let the Medes take it because they kind of worked as a collective group to defeat Nineveh. Anyway, one of them took it. Okay, so verse 10. This is after the battle now. It says, she is empty, desolate, and waste. The heart melts and the knees shake. So anybody who's still left in the city at this point, they're terrified. It says, much pain is in every side. It's fairly different than the ESV. But anyway, the point is that they're terrified, they're in agony. It says, and all their faces are drained of color. So they're shocked, basically, at what has happened, okay? All right, so verse 11, where is the dwelling of the lions? So these last two verses here, 11 and 12, is referring to Assyria as a lion. And so why would they do that? Well, some of Assyrians' gods are depicted as lions or partially a lion. So their god of war was a combination of a lion and some other animal or even a human, I can't remember, but as a combo of a lion and something else. Ishtar, the goddess I mentioned a minute ago, is sometimes depicted as riding on a lion. And then Sennacherib, one of the most famous kings, referred to himself as a lion at one point. And so there's this imagery that Assyria often kind of refers to itself as a lion. But in the Bible often refers to Israel and Judah as sheep and its enemies as lions, okay? So it's just sort of the motif that is typically carried throughout the Old Testament. So what it's going to be talking about in these two verses is, in the past, Assyria has viewed itself as a lion, and they would hoard all of their stuff that they accumulated from conquering other nations into their, quote, lion's den, okay? So Nineveh is the lion's den that they had brought all this stuff into. So if you kind of keep that in mind, the metaphor here starts to make quite a bit of sense. So verse 11, it says, where is the dwelling of the lions? and the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion walked, the lioness, and the lion's cub, and no one made them afraid. In other words, Nineveh enjoyed a long period of peace. If you lived in Nineveh, you thought you were safe because no one would come attack you. It was well fortified. It had all this wealth, and they thought they were very safe. So verse 12, the lion tore in pieces enough for his cubs. In other words, they had accumulated so much wealth that it could pass down for generations and generations. They killed for his lionesses, filled his caves with prey and his dens with flesh. So verse 13, it says, behold, I am against you. So who's bringing all this upon Nineveh? And who is Nineveh's real enemy? Well, God. Okay, God is the one bringing this upon Nineveh. Why? So if you remember, Nineveh, or Assyria specifically, was God's tool to punish his own people. So God chose Assyria to punish Israel and took them into captivity, and also to punish Judah. But Assyria went beyond what God wanted them to do, okay, as, often happens, okay? So when Assyria went beyond what God expected of them, then God in turn had to punish them as well, okay? And so God is their real enemy, and God is now using a different nation to punish them. So he's using Babylon to punish Assyria, okay? All right, so he says, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. And the Lord of hosts, when that phrase appears, that's usually a military term. So he's kind of expounding on the fact that God is stronger than their military. He's the one in control. So it says, I will burn your chariots in smoke. And that was a military tactic of the Assyrians. So when they would attack somebody else, they would burn their chariots. So again, the idea of what goes around comes around. And then it says, and the sword shall devour your young lions. The Assyrians often would brag in their chronicles about defeating other countries by the sword. So now God's saying, I'm going to defeat you by the sword. Then it says, I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall be heard no more. And the messengers there are the ones that would go out on behalf of Assyria and taunt or spread terror to these other countries. So if you remember, the Rabshakeh appeared before Jerusalem and, kind of terrified the people. And so he would have been one of the messengers that's being referred to here. So again, the whole idea is all this evil you have done to other people is going to come back on you now, okay? That's chapter 2. Does anybody have any questions on chapter 2? Okay, chapter 3, we're not going to finish chapter 3 tonight, but it's fairly similar to chapter 2. But it is a separate poem, so you'll notice it starts off a little different. It starts off with woe. You never want to be woed by God. Okay, that always ends bad. So it starts off with that. It says, woe to the bloody city. So why is it called the bloody city? It's because of all the bloodshed they have caused other people. So all the wealth that they have in Nineveh is the result of war or extortion from all these other countries. So that's why it's called the bloody city. The next line, it is full of lies and robbery. Why does God call them liars and robbers? So what they would do is they would, defeat another country or threaten them, and then they would make them a vassal state, okay? But to get those other countries to agree to be a vassal state, Assyria would make certain promises to them that they never intended to keep, okay? They would lie to them and say, if you become a vassal, then I will do this for you or whatever. And then they would never make good on the stuff that they promised to them. But that was their way of extorting all this money and stuff from them, was by lying to them and getting them to give them their wealth and then be like, ha ha ha, joke's on you at this point. So That's what it's talking about when it says that. And then it says its victims, its victim never departs. It just means, the ESV says there's no end to its prey, which means, they would have done this forever if they could have kept getting away with it, basically. Verse 2 now is where the battle starts again. So we saw the battle in chapter 2. Now we're going to see the battle again in chapter 3. So it says the noise of a whip and the noise of rattling wheels, of galloping horses, of clattering chariots. And the idea is this is the cavalry starting to advance on the city. Verse 3, horsemen charge with bright sword and glittering spear. There is a multitude of slain, a great, that first line kind of goes with the previous verse. Again, you have the cavalry. The last 4 lines describe the outcome of the battle, which is there's just dead bodies everywhere, basically, okay? So it says, there is a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses, they stumble over the corpses. So it's a pretty big slaughter, basically, that has happened. And I think I mentioned this last week. So one of the historical records suggests, Nineveh was sort of considered as a pretty hard place to defeat. Because it was, it had high walls around it. There was the river on one side and so forth. So they kind of made it hard to attack. But like I mentioned last week, so how could a place that's hard to attack be so easily defeated? Well, they're defeated because God wants them defeated. That makes it pretty easy when God's on your side. But the other reason it may have been easy is the Assyrians were known to have a bit of a drinking problem. And some of the historical documents suggest that a lot of them were actually drunk when the battle happened. And so they weren't really effective at defending themselves when this occurred because a lot of them were too drunk to really fight. And perhaps that was part of the issue. But anyway, it was a pretty lopsided victory for the Medes, Scythians, and particularly the Babylonians, who all collectively fought against Nineveh. Okay, verse 4, it says, because of the multitudes of harlotries of the seductive harlot. So now Nineveh is being described as a prostitute. And it says, the mistress of sorceries. The literal Hebrew is let me just check something here. Yeah, so let me just cross-reference this. Okay, so the ESV and the New King James are pretty different here. So in the New King James where it says seductive harlot, the ESV just says graceful there. But what does that mean? It means, the word literally means something that is attractive to a man. So you get the idea of a seductive harlot. And then when it says the mistress of sorceries, the Hebrew is literally a mistress of witchcraft, is the idea. So the idea is, I'll read the next line and then I'll tell you what it's about. So it says, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries. So what it's talking about, again, this is the idea that I covered a minute ago, is that one way Assyria would get countries to become in their vassal state is they'd lie to them, okay? And they would tell them they'd make these promises that they wouldn't keep to them. And so that's what it's talking about when it's calling them a prostitute or a harlot, or a mistress of sorcery or a mistress of witchcraft. The idea is that you're basically a liar and you're deceiving people to get them to fall under your control or your spell, if you want to call it that. And so what they also would do is they would take a country in as a vassal state, and then they might sell them to one of their other vassal states so to make even more money off of them. So their real goal was, it was one about power, but two, a lot of it was about money. And so they were very ruthless with the countries that they took over, okay? And so that's why God, through Nahum, is calling them these names at this point. All right, so what's going to happen to them? Verse 5, it says, "Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts." Again, Lord of hosts is sort of a military type phrase, and it's saying that God is really the one behind this, that he is the one who is against them, and he is the one that's bringing Babylon to punish them, okay? And then it says, got some creative imagery here. It says, "I will lift up your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame." So what is this getting at? Well, this is what Assyria would do to other countries. So when they would defeat them, they would oftentimes parade them through the city to mock them and make fun of them. So what would they do to the men? The men, they would strip them down naked and parade them around through the streets to laugh at them. And the women, they would make them lift their skirts, not necessarily over their head, like this says, but they would lift their skirts in a way to make them, to mock them, okay? And this is actually depicted in Assyrian art. There are still art from Assyria that's left that shows this, where they would march prisoners or captives, nude male captives and female captives with their skirt lifted up through the streets to mock them, okay? So now he's saying, okay, I'm going to do the same to you. I'm going to mock you in the same way you have mocked other people. But who will see this, that they're being mocked? Well, the entire ancient Near East is going to see it, okay? Everybody, when Assyria goes down, they're the main player in the whole ancient Near East. And when people know that they went down, everybody's going to mock them, okay? You can think of one of the major countries in the world today. If that country just suddenly ceased to exist because they were defeated by somebody else, especially if they were a country that nobody else liked, would not most people laugh at it, okay? And that's exactly what he's saying, okay? So he's making the claim that once this happens, you're going to be mocked just like all the people that you mocked, okay? All right, so verse 6, it says, "I will cast abominable filth upon you, make you vile, and make you a spectacle." Okay, so just like they made all the other people that they captured a spectacle, God's going to make them a spectacle. Yeah, I assume when it says I'm going to, cast filth on you, that means he would like figuratively parade them around and throw stuff at them, which is what they would do as well. All right, so verse 7, "It shall come to pass that all who look upon you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Where shall I seek comforters for you?" So this is obviously a rhetorical question. So the idea is, okay, once everybody knows that you've been defeated and you've been you've been shamed in the process, and they know your city is destroyed, who is going to feel sorry for you, and who can I find that's going to come in and mourn for you? So, back at that time, if someone passed away, you would bring in mourners to help with the funeral procession and so forth. And he's asking, where am I going to find people to come in and comfort you or mourn for you? And the answer is nowhere, because everybody hates them, okay? Nobody's going to mourn this. Everybody's going to cheer when this happens. So he's not going to be able to find anybody to mourn them. Nobody likes this country, okay? All right, so verse 8. Now verse 8 through 10, he's going to start a new little subsection here that requires a little bit of historical context. And we'll probably stop after this tonight. Has the first bell rang? Is it late tonight? Because it's usually rang by now. Anyway, if y'all start seeing people out there, just tell me. So I'll read the first line of verse 8. It says, are you better than, and the New King James says, no Ammon. What is no Ammon? If you have another translation, it probably says Thebes. Okay, so no Ammon is another name for the city of Thebes. Why is it called no Ammon? Ammon was the main god of the city of Thebes. So that's why it's called that. All right, so where is Thebes and what is he talking about? Thebes is in Upper Egypt. And I forget the dynasties because I can't remember all the dynasty numbers exactly, but prior to this, Thebes had become the capital of Egypt for a while during the time of Ramses and some of the other kings or pharaohs of Egypt. And it had become a very wealthy city. It was also an extremely large city. But the thing about Thebes is it was very difficult to attack because it was on the Euphrates River, but all the way around it was nothing but desert. Okay, so the only way you could attack it would be to come down the river because you couldn't cross the desert to get to it. Okay, so that made it extremely hard to attack because you'd have to get your entire army to come down the river, basically, to try to attack this place. So what happened is at various times, as you kind of go down through the ages, Thebes became sometimes controlled by Egypt and sometimes controlled by Ethiopia. There's some times in the history where Egypt is weak and Ethiopia takes it over, and then it kind of goes back and forth. And that's why you're going to see both of these, there we go, both of these countries mentioned here in these three verses. So he's talking about the city of Thebes. Now, why all of a sudden are we talking about something in Egypt? It's because the Assyrians captured this city in 663, okay? So they took over Thebes, and I think this is the furthest they got into Egypt. So if you remember, their real goal throughout their history was to push and get Egypt. Why did they want to get control of Egypt? Egypt was sort of the breadbasket of the ancient Near East. If you had Egypt, then you had all these additional resources that you could supply to your country, particularly food, but also trade and so forth. Okay, so they were pushing into Egypt, and they eventually captured Thebes, which is a major accomplishment because of how hard it was to capture that particular city, okay? All right, so with that kind of background in mind, we'll look through these verses. So he says, are you better than Thebes? Meaning, are you safer than Thebes? So Thebes was really hard to attack, but is Nineveh harder than Thebes to attack or not as hard as Thebes to attack? That's what he's asking. He says that was situated by the river, the Euphrates River, that had the waters around her, whose rampart was the sea and whose wall was the sea. When he says sea here, he's just talking about the Euphrates River. The idea is that you had to come down the river to attack it, so that's part of its defense, basically. So verse 9, it says, Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was boundless. And so that's the idea where some of the time Ethiopia controlled Thebes, some of the time Egypt controlled Thebes. And your translation may actually say Cush instead of Ethiopia, same place, okay? All right, so it says, Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was boundless. Put and Luban were your helpers. So these were two allies of Egypt and Ethiopia at the time. Put, we're not really sure what that is. It may be part of Somalia. Luban, some translations just say Libya instead of Luban. So that may be what that is. Ethiopia or Cush is not modern day Ethiopia. It would be modern day Sudan, okay? All right, so it says, verse 10, yet she was carried away, meaning Thebes, because Assyria captured it. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed to pieces. So this is typical of Assyria. When they would come in, they were ruthless, all right? And so it's saying that, they killed your children, or Assyria killed their children when you attacked them. It says, at the head of every street, meaning the kids were killed on every street. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. So in other words, Assyria took out their men that they deemed useful to them, and I'm sure they paraded them around and made them look foolish in the process. But this is what Assyria would do. But the question is that Nahum is posing, or God through Nahum is posing, is, are you safer than Thebes? Okay. Everybody thought Thebes was safe, but Assyria proved that they weren't. But now Nineveh thinks everybody thinks Nineveh is safe, but are they really? Okay. And the answer is no, they're not safe. And not only are they not safe, they're going to be pretty easily taken by Babylon when Babylon comes. And why is that? It's because God is behind it. Okay. So we'll stop there, and we'll finish this next week and then get into the next book. But does anybody have any questions before we go for tonight? All right. The moral of the story is never get on God's bad side, never get woed by God. That would be the takeaway for tonight. Okay, good to see everybody.